Well, following Boris Johnson's first Prime Minister's questions coming up at noon, the Chancellor, Sajid Javid, is due to set out his public spending plans. Joining me to preview that are Poppy Trowbridge, until recently Special Advisor in the Treasury to then Chancellor Philip Hammonds, and Miatta Fahnbulleh, Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation and a one-time advisor to Ed Miliband. Welcome to you both. Now, obviously, this has all been slightly overshadowed by other events, but what are you looking out for in this statement?
Well, look, all the indication seems to be that the government is now loosening the purse strings. And I think it's good that they have acknowledged that they've essentially brought our public services to their knees and they need to start investing. The sorts of sums that are being muted suggest that the level is unlikely to reverse austerity and reverse the cuts we've had since 2010, let alone tackle big challenges like climate change. And I think for me the real clincher is when we have a government that is recklessly talking about no deal, that their own economic watchdog has said would tip us into recession, cost us 30 billion a year and make all of this redundant. I'm not sure that the Chancellor's spending promises will be worth the paper they're written on.
It's hard to disagree. I think Brexit is the biggest thing we need to work out for the good of our economy and household prosperity and businesses up and down this country. And that's why I've argued so plainly for a managed exit. It is essential that we have some visibility for the economy on how we leave the European Union. For me, when it comes to Sajid Javid's spending round, he is going to try and offer a minimum of security to departments for a short period of time. But again, the one thing I haven't really been able to pick up much on is what his plans are for tax cuts. The Prime Minister and Sajid Javid to some degree have been very vocal on their spending plans, but are tax cuts going to form a part of this? That throws the equation off.
Well, let's just take it technically. As we understand it, Philip Hammonds said he thought there might be up to 15 billion of headroom with the right sort of Brexit. We seem to get from the spending plans on health, on the police, on education, pretty close to that 15 billion figure. Now, does that end austerity?
It's along the way to ending austerity. I don't know, how long is a piece of string? Where do you stop? Is it officially reversing? I don't think that's a practical way to look at the next phase of government spending. Austerity was necessary at the time, some would argue.
But that's how they're going to sell it, isn't it?
Theresa May said it was coming to an end. There was no other option but for this government to continue along that path, and I think they're doing what they can to show that they're serious about that.
I think when we crunch the numbers, the rhetoric won't add up to the reality. Yes, there have been cuts, but in the end, whether we're thinking about our schools, whether we're thinking about our hospitals, we're now at the point where actually our public servants are telling us that they can barely function. So it's now a necessity to start investing. And all the analysis that we've done suggests that actually, even if you take something like health, social care, public health, where the government is talking about big numbers, you're talking about something in the magnitude of 16 billion a year in order to not just reverse austerity, but to actually start investing for improvements.
I take your point on investing, but I think this is where we'll see a big decision for the Conservative Party. If they choose to loosen their attitude to borrowing, to relax their attitude to borrowing, they will have to claim that they're doing that in order to invest. And they'll say Labour will do that in order to nationalise, we'll do it to invest. And exactly to your point.
I mean, that is really the crucial issue. I mean, clearly, whether or not Mr Johnson goes for a general election tonight or whether or not Parliament votes for it, this was all stoked up in advance for a likely general election campaign. And does what's being promised today at least head off a substantial part of the threat from the proposals being put forward by Labour?
I mean, so that's what it's planned for. This spending round is more about politics than it is about economics. So they're trying to set up a general election in which they say, we are investing, we recognise...
Well, they are politicians.
Well, yeah, true. But the Chancellor we expect should be thinking about the economy and the good of the economy and the long-term good of the economy. But anyway, they're trying to say to the country, we know that you are under pressure. We've seen the families that are struggling. We've seen the impact on your local service, your public services, and we're doing something about it. I fear that when the numbers start to be interrogated, it will look like it's a drop in the ocean, because in the end, that's what it is. And I come back to investment is only part of the story. There are big challenges, you know, a trend of wage stagnation, the climate emergency, big structural problem, the housing crisis, which requires reform. So spending is not enough. They need big plans for reform, which, at least to Labour's credit, whether you agree with their policies or not, that's the space they're trying to play in.
Now, if we had not had the changes in the government and Philip Hammonds was presenting this, as presumably he was planning for at one stage, would his announcement have been much different from what Sajid Javid is going to come up with?
What I can tell you is there would have been a similar amount of pressure from number 10 to spend and a similar amount of resistance from number 11 to go forward cautiously. But it doesn't matter whether the Conservatives are on Labour's territory when it comes to spending in Whitehall departments, because if they get Brexit wrong, their economic record will be trashed. So that comes first and foremost before we start. I agree the boundaries are changing between how both parties approach borrowing and spending, but right now the onus is on the Conservative Party to get this managed exit right for the good of the economy.
And as far as the specific priorities, I mean, you've talked a number of times about climate change, about housing, but actually aren't things like education, like the police, like the NHS, where the public wants to see the money go?
It is where, because I think they're very real, they're visceral, they're visible. So people, you know, see the pressures on their kids in schools and the teachers. They know that the housing crisis is very obvious to people. So I think there are certain areas that is more in the public consciousness, but you know, it is the duty of government, it is the duty of our politicians to think about the long-term good for the country, and something like climate change that will fundamentally change the game in so many ways. And it's not impacting in a visceral way now, which is why maybe it's not at the top of people's mind, although it's raising up the agenda. That's exactly the space where we need governments to step in and actually work and invest in the long term.
But we've already had a bit of a flutter over fuel duty increases, and the conclusion appears to be that whatever you say about the environment, it's impossible to get people to pay more for their fuel.
I don't think it's impossible at all, but it depends on what your priorities are. And we all know governments have to set priorities. They cannot get it all done. And right now, this executive is totally consumed with Brexit and the internal party divisions. Sajid Javid is trying to set out what he can for a degree of certainty for Whitehall departments for a short period of time. But as we can all observe, he is utterly distracted by the pressures coming from number 10, who think they're going into a general election. One thing I can say on police numbers, I do know that that's particular interest of Sajid Javid's. He was Home Secretary, he fought for that. I think today, you know, he's probably thinking privately that at least he's been able to deliver on that for that constituency. Education, of course, another one, but that's where they'll need to really make headlines today.
And quite a big personal challenge for him too.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's difficult. There are clear tensions between number 10 and number 11, always the way. And I think it is difficult. And I think actually the context in which he's, you know, I'm sure he marks himself as a kind of reasonable conservative at a time when the Conservative Party and the leadership don't feel very reasonable when they're purging their own. So I think the dynamics are very, very difficult. It's a tough time to be trying to do a spending round when you're trying to seem reasonable and like you care about the good of the country. And on the other side, you're talking crazy talk about crashing out with a no deal.
OK, well, I'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed.